They say that a house is just four walls and a roof, but they're wrong. A house is a vessel for memories. It's the echo of laughter in an empty hallway, the ghost of sunlight on a wooden floor, the silent witness to every argument and every embrace. Our house, the one on Sycamore Ridge, wasn't just a house. It was the blueprint of my heart, drawn to scale and brought to life. And I remember the last perfect evening within its walls with a clarity so sharp it still feels like I could reach out and touch it. If I close my eyes, I can almost believe that none of it ever happened, that the life Liam and I built is still waiting for me just beyond the veil of a terrible dream. The late afternoon sun, the color of warm honey, was streaming through the floor to ceiling windows that made up the entire western wall of our living room. It was my favorite feature, a design choice Liam had called my grand statement. He was an engineer, a man of logic and practicality, while I was the architect, the dreamer. He calculated the load-bearing capacity. I imagined the way light would dance across the room. Together, we were a perfect structure. The light caught the dust motes as they floated lazily in the air, each one a tiny, sparkling universe. Our 5-year-old son, Leo, was on the floor, his tongue sticking out in concentration as he built a magnificent wobbly tower of wooden blocks. The gentle clatter of his construction was the only sound, a peaceful rhythm that filled the high-ceilinged space. "Higher, Mommy, higher!" he'd giggled, pointing a chubby finger at his creation. I was curled up in the reading nook Liam had insisted we build, a deep, cushioned alcove set into the wall with its own dedicated lamp. "It's already taller than you are, little man," I said, my voice soft. From that nook, I could see almost the entire house. The open concept living space flowed into a kitchen with a massive granite island where Liam was currently leaning, scrolling through his phone. He looked up and caught my eye, and the smile that spread across his face was the foundation of my world. It was a slow, easy smile that made the fine lines around his eyes crinkle. He was 32, but he had the kind of timeless, gentle face that it was a physical manifestation of our partnership, a testament to the life we were building, brick by loving brick. Liam pushed himself off the counter and walked over to me, his footsteps silent on the wood floors. He knelt in front of the nook and took my hand, his thumb tracing circles over my knuckles. "What are you thinking about, Elara?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Just this," I whispered, gesturing with my free hand to the room, to Leo, to the golden light. "All of it. How did we get so lucky?" "It's not luck," he said, his gaze serious. "It was a plan, remember? You drew it." He leaned in and kissed me, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of the coffee he was always drinking. But as he pulled away, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow that hadn't been there a moment before. It was a look I'd come to recognize, one that usually appeared after a phone call with his mother. Everything okay? I asked, my brow furrowing. Did you talk to Eleanor today? He sighed, a barely audible sound, and ran a hand through his dark hair. Yeah, just the usual. A gentle reminder about the Foundation's annual gala next month. She wants to make sure we're front and center at the Caldwell table. He forced a smile. You know how she is. It's all about presenting the right image. The Caldwells, my in-laws. They were old money, the kind that came with a sprawling estate on the other side of town and a family name etched onto university libraries and hospital wings. Eleanor, his mother, was the matriarch, a woman as formidable and polished as the marble in her foyer. His father, Richard, was quiet and stern, and his older brother, Mark, was the heir apparent, groomed from birth to take over the family's vast financial empire. They were complicated. They had never been openly unkind to me, but there was a distance, a polite but impenetrable wall that I could never seem to cross. To them, I felt I would always be the scholarship girl their brilliant son had married, the girl with artistic hands instead of a trust fund. Liam protected me from the worst of it, but I always felt their silent judgment, their unspoken belief that I wasn't quite one of them. Well, I said, trying to keep my tone light, we'll put on our best clothes and smile for the cameras. For you. The deck overlooked a stretch of protected woodland, and the air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. The stars were just beginning to appear, pinpricks of light in the deep velvet sky. I was thinking, he said quietly, his breath warm against my ear. That empty plot of land down by Miller's Creek, the one with the old oak tree. I smiled. What about it? I think you should buy it. I think you should design a community library. Something beautiful. Something for everyone. I'll handle the financing. It can be your first solo project, your legacy. Tears pricked my eyes. It was a dream I'd barely spoken aloud, a fantasy I'd thought was years away. He had heard the whisper of my heart and wanted to make it a reality. That was Liam. He saw the best in me and wanted the rest of the world to see it too. A legacy? I laughed softly. We're only 32. It's a bit early to be talking about legacies. He squeezed me tighter. It's never too early to start building something that will outlast you. He turned me around to face him, his hands cupping my face. His eyes were so full of love, so full of promises for a future I believed was written in stone. We have so much time, Alara, all the time in the world. And I believed him. I leaned my head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart, a rhythm I thought would be the soundtrack to the rest of my life. I stood there, wrapped in the arms of the man I loved, in the house we built, with our beautiful son sleeping soundly inside, and I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost terrifying. It was a perfect moment, the last perfect moment. And if I had known it was the end, I would have held on so much tighter. I would have memorized every second, every breath, every beat of his heart before it was all stolen away in the blink of an eye. The world ends not with a bang, but with a phone call. For me, it was at 11:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I was awake, watching the numbers on the digital clock flip over, wondering why Liam wasn't home yet. He'd gone to meet with a contractor about a potential issue at one of his work sites, a 2-hour drive away. It was a last-minute trip, something he'd grumbled about but said was necessary. "I'll be back before midnight," he'd promised, kissing me and a sleeping Leo goodbye. But the minutes were ticking past his deadline, and a cold, slithering anxiety was beginning to coil in my stomach. I told myself it was just a traffic jam, a dead battery. He identified himself as a state trooper. He asked if I was Elara Clark. He asked if my husband was Liam Caldwell, and then, with practiced, sterile compassion, he began to speak in sentences that didn't make sense. Words like single vehicle accident, icy patch on the bridge, and unresponsive at the scene. I remember thinking it was a mistake. They had the wrong number, the wrong name. My Liam was safe. My Liam was on his way home to me. "Ma'am, are you still there?" the voice asked. I was holding the phone so tightly my knuckles were white, but I couldn't feel my hand. I couldn't feel anything. The living room, our beautiful, warm living room, suddenly seemed vast and cold. The moonlight streaming through the windows looked sterile, like the light in a hospital. Is he okay?" I finally managed to whisper, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. There was a pause, a small, terrible silence that held the entire weight of my future. "Ma'am," the trooper said gently, "I'm so sorry. Your husband did not survive." And just like that, the blueprint of my life was set on fire. The walls of my world collapsed, the foundation turned to dust, and I was left standing in the wreckage with the echo of his last promise all the time in the world, mocking me in the ruins. I don't remember hanging up. I remember a sound, a raw, guttural noise that I vaguely recognized as coming from me. I slid down the wall, my legs no longer able to support me, and landed on the cold oak floors we had chosen together. My mind was a blizzard of white noise, a storm of disbelief and horror. The only clear thought that broke through was a single devastating word: Leo. Our son was sleeping peacefully in his room, dreaming of brave little bears, completely unaware that his entire world had just been broken. I must have called his parents. It's the only explanation for what happened next. An hour or maybe a lifetime later, headlights swept across the living room windows. The front door opened, not with a knock, but with the turn of a key. I'd forgotten they still had one from when we were building the house. Eleanor Caldwell swept in first, a cashmere coat, draped perfectly over her shoulders despite the late hour. She was followed by her husband, Richard, and their son, Mark. They stood in the entryway for a moment, their presence sucking the very air from the room. My grief was a messy, ugly, physical thing. I was still on the floor, tears streaming down my so grotesquely out of place that it momentarily silenced my sobs. "What?" "His last words," she repeated, her voice perfectly even. "It's important to remember." Mark rushed forward then, a flicker of genuine humanity in his eyes. "Mom, For God's sake, look at her. He knelt beside me, placing an awkward hand on my shoulder. Alara, we are so sorry. This is unimaginable. But Eleanor was already moving past us, her gaze sweeping over the living room. She walked over to the mantelpiece above the fireplace, where a framed photo of Liam and me on our wedding day sat. She picked it up, her gloved fingers brushing a speck of invisible dust from the glass. He was a good son, she said, her voice distant, as if she were delivering a eulogy to an empty room. He had so much potential, a legacy to build. She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking to the house, to the memory of the son she believed belonged only to her. Richard, Liam's father, hadn't moved from the doorway. He just stood there, his face an unreadable mask of stone, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked at me on the floor, and I saw nothing in his eyes. No sympathy, no shared sorrow, just a profound, unnerving emptiness. I finally found my voice, ragged and torn. He was on his way home, I stammered, pulling myself into a sitting position. There was ice on a bridge. Eleanor placed the photo back on the mantel, but not before adjusting it, so it was perfectly centered. The small, precise movement was so jarring, so utterly devoid of emotion, that it sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. The bridge on Route 7? She asked sharply. Why was he on that road? It's treacherous in the winter. She turned her gaze on me, and for the first time, I saw something beyond her icy composure. It was a glint of something hard and sharp. It was accusation. He was coming back from that meeting with the steel supplier, wasn't he? The one you were so insistent he attend in person. The blood drained from my face. The meeting had been my idea. The supplier had made an error, and I thought a face-to-face conversation, Liam's calm, logical presence, would smooth things over better than a phone call. It it was for a project, I whispered. Our project. I see, she said. The two words were heavy with implication, dripping with a poison I could feel seeping into my veins. Practical tones about funeral directors and press releases. The Caldwell name requires a certain level of discretion, Eleanor stated, as if our personal tragedy were a corporate merger gone wrong. At one point, I heard a noise from upstairs, and my heart seized. Leo. I had forgotten in the chaos about Leo. I scrambled to my feet. I need to go to him. Eleanor blocked my path. He's sleeping. Let him rest. There's no need to upset the boy until morning. He's my son, I said, my voice rising with a protective fury that momentarily cut through the fog of grief. I will decide when to tell him his father is gone. Her eyes narrowed. He is a Caldwell, and we will handle this as a family. I stared at her, at the cold certainty on her face, and a horrifying realization dawned. The accident hadn't just taken my husband, it had taken my life, my future, and plunged me into a war I didn't even know had been declared. They weren't mourning the man I loved, they were mourning the loss of a piece of their legacy. And as I looked at their composed, grieving faces, I understood that they would stop at nothing to preserve that legacy, even if it meant destroying what was left of me in the process. I was no longer a daughter-in-law. I was a loose end, a complication, and my beautiful home, the vessel of all my happy memories, suddenly felt like their territory. It was the first battleground. There are two kinds of grief. There is the kind that tears through you, a wild and holy storm that leaves you shattered but cleansed. And then there is the kind that is managed, curated, and presented to the world. A grief so meticulously arranged that you become a visitor in your own sorrow. In the week between Liam's death and his funeral, I learned the profound and suffocating cruelty of the second kind. The Caldwells did not mourn their son, they administered his death. And in their perfectly executed pageant of sorrow, I was not the grieving widow. I was a logistical problem, a messy emotional complication in their otherwise pristine narrative. The day after Liam died, Eleanor informed me that we, meaning myself and Leo, would be staying at the Caldwell estate until after the funeral. It was not a request. The house on Sycamore Ridge is too isolated, she stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. And there will be callers, the media. It must all be handled from a central, secure location. My home, our sanctuary, was reduced to a security risk. I was too weak, too broken to fight, so I allowed her to. And there was not a single object that suggested a life of comfort or joy had ever been lived within its walls. It was the architectural embodiment of Eleanor herself, impressive, cold, and utterly devoid of warmth. In that house, my grief was an inconvenience. When I cried, I was gently but firmly guided to my guest room, as if my tears might stain the Persian rugs. When Leo, who was now grappling with a monstrous confusion he couldn't comprehend, had a tantrum, Eleanor would appear and tell him in a low, firm voice, "A Caldwell man controls his emotions, Leo. Your father was always very composed." She was trying to erase the part of him that was me, the messy, human, emotional part, and replace it with their rigid code of conduct. She was not comforting her grandson. She was training an heir. The funeral arrangements became Eleanor's magnum opus. I had envisioned a small private service. I wanted to read a poem Liam loved, to play the song from our first dance. I wanted his friends from college and work to share stories, to remember the funny, brilliant, kind man he was. When I tried to voice these wishes, Eleanor looked at me with a sort of weary pity, the way one might look at a child asking for candy before dinner. "Elera, dear," she said, placing a cool hand on my arm, "Liam was not just your husband. He was a Caldwell. The community expects to pay their respects. We have a responsibility to uphold. The service would be at the city's grandest cathedral. The mayor would speak. A string quartet would play Handel. My personal memories, our shared life, were irrelevant. His death, like his life, was a public relations event. Mark, Liam's older brother, tried to be the mediator, the bridge between his mother's iron will and my crumbling spirit. He would find me in the vast, silent library, offering me a cup of tea I didn't want. "I know this is hard," he'd say, his voice a low, reasonable hum. "Mom can be a lot, but you have to understand this is how she processes things, by taking control, by making sure every detail is perfect. It's her way of honoring him. By erasing me," I asked one afternoon, my voice raw, "by turning his funeral into a state dinner. That wasn't Liam, Mark. He would have hated this." He sighed, polishing his expensive glasses on a silk handkerchief. He also understood his responsibilities. "Look, Elora, you're thinking emotionally right now. and that's understandable. But my parents are thinking about the long term, about Leo, about protecting the family's legacy, Liam's legacy. There it was again. That he was his mother's most effective lieutenant. Richard, my father in law, remained a ghost in the proceedings. He would drift through the cavernous rooms, a glass of scotch in his hand, his face set in a permanent scowl. He never spoke to me, never acknowledged Leo. He would just watch, his silence a heavy, oppressive blanket. One evening, desperate for any connection, for anyone to see the man I had lost, instead of the asset they had, I approached him as he stood staring out a window. "Richard," I began, my voice trembling. "I was just remembering the time Liam tried to build that treehouse for Leo. He got the plans completely backward. We laughed so hard." He turned his head slowly, his eyes cold and empty. He looked at me for a long moment, a flicker of something, contempt, annoyance, in his gaze. Then he simply turned back to the window without a word. The dismissal was so absolute, so profound, it felt like a slap. I was invisible to him. My memories were worthless. I began to understand then why they saw me as an obstacle. It wasn't just my background or my emotional nature. With Liam gone, I held all the cards they wanted. I was the mother of his only child, the heir to his personal fortune, and the owner of the house on Sycamore Ridge. I was a branch of the family tree that had grown wild outside of their manicured garden, and now they were determined to prune it back, to bring everything and everyone under their control. The day of the funeral was cold and grey, the sky weeping a miserable drizzle. The cathedral was filled with hundreds of people I didn't know, faces from the city's social register who had come to be seen. I sat in the front pew, a black veil Eleanor had insisted upon covering my face, feeling like an actress in a play I hadn't rehearsed. I listened to strangers speak about a version of my husband I barely recognized. Liam, the astute board member, Liam, the promising philanthropist, Liam, the proud scion of the Caldwell family. The man who made terrible pizza and sang off-key lullabies to his son was nowhere to be found. I was a ghost at my own husband's funeral. After the service, back at the cold, silent mansion, Eleanor found me standing alone in the conservatory. The mourners had left. The performance was over. She held a thin, leather-bound folder in her hands. "A tragic day," she said, her voice devoid of any real emotion. "But one must be practical. There are things to be dealt with now. Liam's affairs." I looked at her, exhausted down to my soul. "Can this not wait, Eleanor, please?" She gave me a thin, "We must protect Leo's inheritance." I stared at her, a cold dread washing over me, even colder than the grief that had consumed me for a week. The house. She was talking about my house, and in her eyes I saw the glint of a plan, a strategy that had been formulated long before this conversation. I finally understood. They had not just taken over his death, they were planning to take over my life. Rock bottom is not a sudden, violent crash. It is a slow, cold descent. It begins when the casseroles stop arriving and the condolence calls trickle to a stop. It happens when the world, which had the decency to pause for a moment in honor of your tragedy, decides it has waited long enough and begins to spin again, leaving you behind in the suffocating stillness of your new reality. For 2 weeks after Liam's funeral, I existed in that stillness, a ghost haunting the rooms of my own life. I moved through the beautiful sunlit spaces of our home, but the light no longer warmed me. Every corner held a memory that was now a fresh wound. I was living inside a museum of a life that was no longer mine, and the silence was deafening. It was in that silence that the final blow came, not with a roar, but with the quiet, civilized click of a briefcase latch. The summons came in the form of a phone call from Mark. "Elara," he'd said, his voice smooth and unnervingly cheerful. "Mom and I would like you to come by the house tomorrow morning. We need to go over some of Liam's estate paperwork with the family lawyer. Just a formality." A formality. I should have known then. In the Caldwell vernacular, formality was a code word for an execution. I found them waiting for me in the estate's library, the same room where Mark had offered his hollow sympathies just weeks before. Eleanor was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, looking regal and severe. Mark stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, looking anywhere but at me. A third man, thin and vulture-like in a tailored suit, was introduced as Mr. Davies, the family's attorney for the past 40 years. He did not offer his hand. "Thank you for coming, Elara," Eleanor began, gesturing to the hard, unwelcoming chair opposite her desk. "We want to make this process as painless as possible." The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in civilized cruelty. Mr. Davies spoke in a dry, emotionless monotone, explaining the intricacies of something called the Caldwell Generational Trust, a legal entity established by Liam's grandfather. He explained that years ago, when Liam was just 21, he had signed documents making him a beneficiary. A small portion of that trust's funds had been used as part of the down payment. Any primary real estate asset acquired using trust funds automatically reverts to the stewardship of the trust's primary executor, to be managed in the best interest of the beneficiary's direct heir. I stared at him, my mind struggling to cut through the dense legal fog. "I'm sorry, I don't understand. What does that mean?" It was Eleanor who answered, her voice cutting through the legalese with chilling clarity. "It means, Elara, that the house is not yours. It belongs to the trusts. And I," she added, a faint triumphant smile playing on her lips, "am the executor. The house will be held by the trusts for Leo until he comes of age." The world tilted. The blood rushed in my ears, a roaring sound that drowned out everything else. "No," I whispered, "that's not possible. My name is on the deed. I designed that house. I helped build it." "A regrettable oversight on Liam's part. Not updating the paperwork after your marriage," Davies said smoothly. "But the trust's claim predates the deed. It is legally ironclad." I looked at Mark, my eyes pleading. He had to know this was wrong. He had to see the monstrous injustice of it. He finally met my gaze, and what I saw in his eyes broke what was left of my heart. It was not anger or malice. It was pity, and it was weakness. "Elara, it's for the best," he said softly. "The house is a huge expense. The property taxes, the upkeep. You're in no state to manage an asset of that value right now. Mom is just trying to secure Leo's future." They were framing it as a kindness. They were gaslighting me into believing they were saving me from myself, protecting me from the burden of my own home. The condescension was so profound, so absolute. It was breathtaking. An asset. My voice was trembling, but it was laced with a new, unfamiliar fire. "You dare to call my home an asset, my son's home. It is everything we have left of him. It is every memory, every dream. It is the floorboards he crawled on and the walls that heard his first words. You cannot take that from us. I stood up, my hands flat on the polished surface of the desk, leaning towards Eleanor. All the politeness, all the fear was gone, burned away by a sudden white hot rage. You will not do this, I said, my voice low and dangerous. I will fight you. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her expression one of mild amusement. She looked at me as if I were a particularly stubborn insect, and then she delivered the words that would become the fuel for the rest of my life. I saw her for what she was, not a grieving mother, but a corporate raider, seizing the last remaining property of a life she deemed a failed acquisition. There was nothing left to say. The battle was over before I even knew I was on the field. Davis slid a document across the desk. You have until Friday to vacate the premises, he said. The trust has authorized a one-time payment of $50,000 to assist in your relocation and living expenses, contingent on your full and immediate cooperation. A payoff. They were throwing money at me to disappear quietly. I looked at the check, then back at Eleanor's cold, triumphant face. I wanted to tear it to pieces, to scream, to break something, but I didn't. I simply turned and walked out of the room, my silence my only remaining weapon. The drive back to Sycamore Ridge was a blur. When I walked through the front door, the house seemed to mock me with its beauty and light. Our home for 3 more days. That evening, I had to do the hardest thing I have ever done. I sat down with my 5-year-old son in the reading nook his father had built for us and tried to explain the unexplainable. Honey, I began, my voice thick with unshed tears. We have to go on an adventure. We're going to leave this house and find a new one. Leo's face crumpled in confusion. But why? I like this house. Daddy built this house. I know, sweetie, but some people, some people say we can't live here anymore. Who? He asked, his voice small. Grandma Eleanor. The fact that he knew that even at 5 years old, he had absorbed the toxic dynamics and identified the source of our pain was a final, devastating blow. I pulled him into my arms and held him tight, my tears finally falling, soaking into his soft hair. It's going to be okay, I whispered, a promise I had no idea how I would keep. It will always be me and you. I will always keep you safe. On Friday morning, I packed one large suitcase with our most essential clothes and Leo's favorite toys. I left everything else. The furniture we had picked out together, the books that lined our shelves, the pots and pans in the kitchen. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me haul away the remnants of my life like salvage. As we stood in the doorway for the last time, I took one final look. I memorized the way the light fell across the floor, the scent of the wood, where no one would look at me with pity, or at my son with the calculating eyes of an heir. I rented a small third-floor walk-up apartment in a neighborhood that smelled perpetually of rain-soaked asphalt and frying onions. The windows overlooked a brick wall, and the sound of sirens was our new lullaby. After the sun-drenched, silent expanse of our house on Sycamore Ridge, this cramped, noisy box felt like a physical manifestation of how small my life had become. For the first few months, I did nothing but survive. Survival was a brutal, ugly slog. It was forcing myself to eat when food tasted like ash. It was finding a daycare for Leo, my hands shaking as I filled out the forms under my maiden name, Elara Clark. It was the gut wrenching pain of watching my bright, happy son become quiet and withdrawn, asking in his small voice at bedtime, "Can we go back to Daddy's house tomorrow?" And it was the nightly battle in my own mind, fighting back the echoes of Eleanor's voice, telling me I was nothing, a renter in a life I hadn't built. The grief wasn't a visitor anymore, it was a roommate, a constant, heavy presence in our tiny apartment. My career, my passion, was a ghost. I couldn't bring myself to even look at a blueprint. Architecture was a language I had only ever spoken with Liam. To try and speak it alone felt like a betrayal. I took a job at a print shop, the chemical smell of ink and paper, a harsh substitute for the scent of fresh cut wood and concrete. It was mindless work, just enough to pay for rent and Leo's daycare, but each day it chipped away at another small piece of my soul. I was becoming invisible, even to myself. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday, 3 months into our new gray life. I was finally unpacking the last box, the one I had been avoiding. It was filled with old sketchbooks and papers from my college days. My fingers brushed against a familiar moleskin notebook, one of Liam's. I opened it, and there, tucked between pages of his neat engineering calculations, was a single loose sheet of sketch paper. It was a drawing, a rough, conceptual pencil sketch of a building, all sweeping glass and warm, inviting lines, with an old oak tree framing it. It was the library, the one he had spoken of on that last night, his final gift to me. He had drawn the dream he'd held in his mind. Seeing his handwriting, the familiar, confident strokes of his pencil, was like a physical blow, but underneath the wave of fresh grief, something else. I did something I hadn't done since the accidents. I sharpened a pencil. I took out a clean sheet of paper, and with Liam's sketch propped up against a coffee cup, I began to draw. The first lines were shaky, uncertain, but then the muscle memory returned. The feel of the graphite on the paper, the dance of translating an idea into a form. It felt like coming home. I wasn't just drawing a building, I was fighting back. I was rebuilding myself, one line at a time. That night marked the beginning of my new life. I kept the soul-crushing job at the print shop. I had to, but my nights became my sanctuary. From 9 p.m. until 2 a.m., fueled by cheap coffee and a burning righteous anger, I worked. I filled sketchbooks. I taught myself new rendering software on a second-hand computer. I studied the work of every great architect I had ever admired. I channeled all the pain, all the grief, all the injustice into the work. My designs became bolder, more innovative. I learned to use shadow and light to evoke emotion. I designed spaces that felt like what I had been through. buildings with foundations of sorrow, but with spires that reached for the light. My heartbreak became my unique, undeniable artistic voice. I started entering anonymous online design competitions, small ones at first for bus shelters, park pavilions, community gardens. My first 10 submissions were rejected. The 11th was a finalist but didn't win. Each rejection was a sting, but it was nothing compared to the pain I had already endured. I kept going. I wallpapered a section of our tiny apartment with the rejection emails, a visible reminder of the fight. Leo called it Mommy's Silly War. To me, it was a testament to my resilience. 2 years passed like that. 2 years of grinding, relentless work. Leo started kindergarten, slowly finding his footing, making new friends. We found a new rhythm, a new normal. We had weekly pizza nights on the floor of our apartment, a small tradition that was ours alone. I was no longer just surviving, I was living, breathing, building. Then one day I won. It was a competition to design a new wing for a children's hospital in Seattle. It wasn't a huge prize, but the validation was everything. The posting sent a jolt of electricity through me, making every nerve ending in my body stand on end. The city of Westfield, my old hometown, was announcing its largest public project in a century, a state-of-the-art Center for the Performing Arts. It was a massive, legacy-defining project with a multi-million-dollar budget. The competition was international, prestigious, and, most importantly, the initial submissions were to be judged completely blind. The name of the architect would remain anonymous until the final selection. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page, my heart pounding in my chest, and there it was, in crisp, elegant font. This project is made possible through the generous lead benefaction of the Caldwell Family Foundation. I leaned back in my chair, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. For 3 years, I had been rebuilding my life in the shadows, honing my craft, turning my pain into power. And now, they were presenting me with the perfect stage. They were funding a monument, a testament to their own power and influence. They had no idea they were also funding my return. They thought they had erased me from the blueprint of their lives. They were about to find out that I was the architect, and I was coming home to finish the job. Revenge is a blueprint you draw in the dark. For 6 months, my small office, which still smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings, became a war room. The competition for the Caldwell Performing Arts Center was my entire world. I shut out everything else, taking on only enough small projects to keep the lights on and food on the table for Leo. The rest of the time, from the moment I dropped him at school until long after he was asleep, I lived and breathed the design. This wasn't just another project, it was a reckoning. I didn't want to create something angry or dark. That would have been their victory. Instead, I decided to build them a monument to everything they had failed to understand. My design was a study in contrasts. From a distance, its silhouette was classical, almost severe, with clean, strong lines that I knew would appeal to Eleanor's conservative taste for tradition and power. It was a design that respected the city's history, a building that looked like it belonged. But as you drew closer, you would begin to see the details. The monolithic stone walls were actually composed of thousands of smaller, unique pieces, each one fitting together to create an unbreakable whole. The facade was interspersed with vast, sweeping panels of glass, not to make it fragile, but to flood the interior with light, to create a sense of transparency and honesty. His signature flourish Liam had used in his early sketches that I had always loved. I designed the grand central staircase to have a landing at the exact midway point. A small, quiet space with a view of the sky, a nod to his belief that you should always pause halfway up a climb to appreciate the journey. These were my hidden tributes, a silent conversation with my husband embedded in the very bones of the structure. This building would not just be my legacy, it would be ours. Submitting the final portfolio was an act of profound and terrifying hope. I sent it in under the anonymous designation Studio Peregrine, Peregrine for the falcon that wanders, the traveler that returns home. Then came the silence. For 3 long months, I heard nothing. I threw myself back into my other work, trying to forget, trying to manage the agonizing tension of the wait. Every time the phone rang, my heart would leap into my throat. The email arrived on a Thursday morning. Dear Studio Peregrine, it began. The Westfield Performing Arts Committee is pleased to inform you that your design has been selected as one of 3 finalists. I read the words 5 times before they sank in. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I had done it. I had a seat at the table. The next paragraph detailed the final step, an in-person confidential presentation to the committee in Westfield the following month. And at the bottom of the email was the list of the committee members. The chairwoman, of course, was Eleanor Caldwell. Returning to Westfield was like walking into my own past. I booked a room in an anonymous hotel on the outskirts of town under my name, Elara Clark, knowing the name would mean nothing to a check-in clerk. I changed my appearance subtly. My hair was shorter now, styled more professionally, and I wore sharp, designer glasses I didn't strictly need. I dressed in a severe, elegant charcoal suit. I was not the grieving, broken woman in her early 30s they had cast out. I was Architect 7B, a nameless, confident professional. The Caldwell Foundation's headquarters were downtown, in a sleek glass tower that scraped the sky. As I walked into the 30th floor boardroom, the air felt thin. And there they were. Eleanor sat at the head of the vast marble table, looking exactly the same as if preserved in ice. Mark was to her right, looking older, more tired, the weight of the family empire visible in the lines on his forehead. My father-in-law, Richard, was there too, a silent, brooding presence. The rest of the committee was a collection of the city's elite, faces I recognized from the funeral. None of them gave me a second glance. To them, I was just another architect in a suit. The power of that anonymity was intoxicating. I was the second presenter. When my designation, I met Eleanor's eyes. They were as cold and appraising as ever. There was not a flicker of recognition. To her, I was a stranger. I began to speak, my voice clear and even. I didn't just describe the building, I told its story. Good morning. My design for the Westfield Performing Arts Center is built on a single core philosophy that true strength is not found in opacity but in transparency. It is about resilience. I clicked to a slide showing a close-up of the interlocking stone walls. It's about how many smaller, unique parts can come together to create something unbreakable, something far stronger than a single monolithic block. I could see Mark nodding, impressed. I moved on. The structure is anchored by what appears to be a traditional foundation honoring the city's past, I continued, looking directly at Eleanor. But it rises to embrace the future, using light and open space not as a weakness but as its greatest source of power. It is a space designed to make every single member of the community feel seen, feel welcome, and feel at home. The dramatic irony was so thick I could almost taste it. I was telling them my life story, my philosophy of survival, and they were leaning forward, captivated. I was using the very words strength, resilience, home that they had tried to strip from me and selling them back as a vision they were desperate to buy. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Eleanor spoke, her voice sharp. It's a very emotional design, Architect 7B. This talk of resilience and transparency, art centers are about acoustics and prestige. Are you sure your philosophy doesn't compromise on practicality? The question was a test, a classic Eleanor move to assert dominance. The old me would have withered, but the old me was gone. I met her gaze without flinching. On the contrary, Mrs. Caldwell, I replied, my voice perfectly level. I believe that the most practical and enduring structures are the ones that are built with heart. A building without a soul is just a container. A building with a story becomes a landmark. Prestige is not achieved through coldness, it is achieved through connection. This design will connect with every person who walks through its doors. I saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, quickly masked. She was not used to being challenged, especially not by a nameless young woman. She nodded slowly, a single sharp dip of her chin. Thank you for your time. I packed my material. They didn't know it yet, but they had just listened to the pitch for a beautiful, glorious monument to their own undoing, and they had applauded. Winning the contract was a victory, but a public one, an announcement waiting to happen. Before the world knew my name, I needed a private reckoning. I needed to face the architects of my ruin in a room of my own design, a space where I controlled the light, the acoustics, and the narrative. Revenge, I had learned, wasn't about demolition, it was about forcing the powerful to see the true and undeniable structure of their own cruelty and leaving them to live in it. I used their own machinery against them. I had the foundation's liaison, a man who now unwittingly answered to me, arrange what he called a benefactor's preliminary vision meeting. The official purpose was for the anonymous winning architect to have a private dinner with the Caldwell family to discuss the philanthropic spirit of the project before the public announcement. It was a request dripping with professional deference, an appeal to Eleanor's ego that I knew she couldn't refuse. I chose the venue myself, a minimalist, achingly modern restaurant called Aperture, famous for its stark elegance and funereal quiet. It had a private dining room encased in glass that overlooked the entire city, a glass box where nothing could be hidden. I arrived first. I chose a seat at the long, dark wood table that faced the door so I could watch them enter. When they arrived, they walked in with the easy confidence of people who believed they owned every room they entered. Eleanor first, then Richard, then Mark. They were smiling, expectant, ready to meet the star architect they had chosen. And then they saw me. The moment of recognition was a silent, shattering symphony of reactions. Eleanor's polite smile froze and then collapsed, a sharp, audible intake of breath, the only sound she made. Her hand flew to her pearls, a gesture of shock she couldn't suppress. Mark stopped dead in his tracks, his face paling, his mouth falling slightly open, as if he'd seen a ghost. And Richard, the stoic, unreadable Richard, his face darkened into a thunderous scowl, his eyes locking on mine with a sudden, raw intensity I had never seen before. For 5 full seconds, the only sound was the distant clink of cutlery from the main dining room. The power dynamic of my entire life shifted on its axis in that silence. I was the one who broke it. I stood up slowly, a calm, welcoming smile on my face, the same smile I would offer any client. Eleanor, Richard, Mark, thank you for coming. I'm so glad we could finally meet. They were guests at my table now. After a waiter took our drink orders with practiced invisibility, an excruciating silence descended. It was Mark who finally broke it, his voice strained. Alara, you're architect 7B? Your studio Peregrine? I am, I said simply, taking a sip of water. I looked at Eleanor. I was so pleased the committee connected with my vision for the project. I believe we are going to create something truly extraordinary together. Eleanor had recovered slightly, her mask of icy composure sliding back into place, though her eyes were still wide with shock. This is highly irregular, she said, her voice tight. You were obligated to disclose your personal connection to the foundation. On the contrary, I replied smoothly, the competition rules stipulated total anonymity to ensure the design was judged on its own merits. My personal history is irrelevant to the quality of my work. Wouldn't you agree? You chose the design, after all, the best design. I let that hang in the air. The trap was already sprung. To discredit me now would be to discredit their own judgment, their own committee, in a very public way. I let them squirm for another minute before I began. I'm glad we have this time, I said, my tone shifting to one of thoughtful, professional inquiry. Because to build a truly great public space, one must have a deep understanding of the human experience, of the stories that shape a community. I folded my hands on the table. For example, as a case study, let's consider a hypothetical situation. I looked directly at Mark. Imagine a young man, a beloved son and brother, who dies tragically, and his family, in their grief, tries to manage the situation. Imagine his brother telling the man's widow that her raw, messy sorrow is inappropriate, and that she needs to consider the family's legacy. Mark flinched as if I had struck him, his gaze falling to the table. I shifted my eyes to Richard, who was staring at his water glass with ferocious intensity. Imagine the father of this man, a patriarch, who offers his daughter-in-law no comfort, not a single word, who looks at her as if her grief is an insult to his own, making her feel utterly and completely invisible in her darkest hour. Finally, I turned my full attention to Eleanor. Her face was a mask of fury, but she was trapped by the social contract of the elegant room. She could not scream. She could not cause a scene. She could only sit there, casting them out with a check and the justification that she is merely protecting an investment. The silence in the room was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating. I had not raised my voice. I had not accused them directly. I had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection was hideous. I don't see what this sordid little story has to do with architecture, Eleanor finally hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. It has everything to do with it, I replied, my voice still calm, still level, because architecture at its best is about creating shelter, not just from the rain, but from the cruelties of the world. It is about building spaces that are honest and true and safe. So when you asked me about my vision for the Caldwell Performing Arts Center, I said, leaning forward slightly, it is this. I am going to build a place so full of light and so fundamentally welcoming that it could never be weaponized against anyone. I am going to build a structure that tells a story of resilience, a place where every single person who enters feels seen and valued and safe. I am going to build a home for an entire community because I know intimately what it feels like to have yours stolen away. I pushed my chair back and stood up. Their stunned, horrified faces were a tableau of defeat. Mark looked ashamed, Richard looked for the first time haunted, and Eleanor looked like her entire world had been set on fire. I believe we have a clear understanding of the project's foundational philosophy now, I said, placing my napkin neatly on the table. This was very productive. My office will be in touch to schedule the official public kickoff meeting next week. I turned and walked out of the classroom, leaving them alone with the unspoken truths and the suffocating silence. I didn't look back. I had returned to Westfield as a ghost, but I was leaving that restaurant as a queen who had just checkmated the entire board. There are two kinds of stages in this world, the ones you are forced upon and the ones you build yourself. The day of the public unveiling, I found myself on a stage of my own making, but the front row was filled with the very people who had authored my tragedy. They were trapped now, forced to play a part in a story whose ending they hadn't written. And the air in the grand ballroom of the Westfield Hotel was thick with a tension only a handful of us understood. The room was packed, flanked by city officials and a legion of reporters. The Caldwells sat on the stage under the bright hot lights, looking for all the world like the proud, benevolent patrons they were pretending to be. But I could see the cracks in their. His speech, full of effusive praise for the Caldwell family's unwavering commitment to the cultural enrichment of our great city. With every word of tribute, I could feel their humiliation deepening. They were being lauded for a project that had become a monument to their own hypocrisy. After the mayor, it was Eleanor's turn. She walked to the podium with a practiced, regal grace, but I could see the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted the microphone. Her speech was a masterpiece of forced composure. She spoke about the foundation's long history of giving back, about the importance of the arts, and then she was forced to speak about the design itself. The selection committee was unanimous in its decision, she said, her voice as smooth and cold as marble. We were captivated by a design that spoke not only of artistic excellence, but of a deeper philosophy, a vision of resilience, transparency, and a profound sense of community. I watched, mesmerized, as she was forced to repeat my own words, the very words I had used to dismantle her in that private dining room. She was selling my story, my survival, as her own philanthropic vision. The irony was so potent it was almost poetic. She ended, as I knew she must, with the reveal. This bold new landmark is the work of a truly singular talent, she continued, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. An architect whose vision will now redefine the skyline of our city. it is my honor to introduce the brilliant mind behind Studio Peregrine, Miss Elara Clark. A wave of murmurs rippled through the ballroom. Clark? The name was unfamiliar, but then a few of the older reporters and society watchers began to whisper, their eyes widening in recognition. Wasn't that the name of Liam Caldwell's wife? The widow? The architect? The pieces began to click into place, creating a puzzle no one had expected. I walked onto the stage from the wings, my heels clicking with a steady, confident rhythm on the polished floor. The spotlight found me, and for a moment the entire room was a blur of light and shadow. I reached the podium and turned first to Eleanor. I extended my hand. "Thank you, Eleanor," I said, my voice clear and amplified by the microphone, "for that generous introduction." She had no choice but to take my hand. Her skin was as cold as ice. Her grip was weak, the handshake of a defeated monarch. I turned to face the audience, the sea of expectant faces, the flashing cameras. I took a deep breath. This was it. "Good morning," I began, my voice steady. "Thank you, Mayor Thompson, and thank you to the committee, and a special thank you to the Caldwell Foundation. Like people have souls. They should tell a story. The story I wanted to tell was one of resilience, of finding strength and light in the darkest of places. I wanted to create a space where every single person felt they belonged." I paused, then gestured to the massive screen behind me where a stunning 3D rendering of the building was displayed. But the story of this design, its true heart, did not begin with me. It began with a conversation. It began with a dream shared with my late husband, Liam Caldwell. A collective gasp swept through the room. It was a sound of pure shock. On the stage, Mark visibly flinched, his face crumpling. Eleanor's composure finally, completely shattered. A look of pure, unadulterated fury washed over her face. I clicked a remote in my hand, and the rendering on the screen behind me dissolved. It was replaced by a simple, scanned image of a pencil sketch on a piece of aged paper. It was Liam's drawing of the library. His handwriting was visible in the corner. "On the last evening of his life," I said, my voice softening, becoming more intimate, as if I were speaking to each person in the room individually. "Liam spoke to me about building a place for this city, a gift, a legacy of warmth and community. After he was gone, when I was navigating the most difficult time of my life, I found this sketch he had made, a single, beautiful idea he left behind." Tears were now openly streaming down some faces in the audience. The reporters were scribbling furiously. "For the past 4 years," I said, my voice thick with emotion, but unwavering, "my work has not simply been about building a career. It has been about finishing a conversation with the man I loved. Every line, every curve, every window that lets in the light in this design is a part of that conversation. This Performing Arts Center is not my vision alone. It is the fulfillment of a promise. It is the final, beautiful expression of a brilliant and kind man who loved this city and believed in its people. It is his dream, and I am just the humble architect he trusted to bring it to life. I stopped speaking. The silence in the room was profound, a vacuum of stunned, emotional reverence, and then a single person in the back began to clap, then another and another, and within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted, shining testament to a love they had tried and failed to erase. A standing ovation is a powerful sound. For me, standing on that stage, it was a wave of validation, a roar of public support that washed away years of imposed silence and shame. But for the family sitting behind me, it was the sound of a fortress crumbling to the ground. As the applause thundered through the ballroom, I watched them from the corner of my eye. They were trapped in the spotlight, forced to smile and clap for the woman who had just publicly and gracefully dismantled their entire world. Their faces were frozen masks of horror. In that moment, they weren't the powerful Caldwells, they were simply the architects of their own public humiliation. The aftermath was a whirlwind. My face was on the front page of the Westfield Gazette the next morning. The headlines were more dramatic than I could have ever imagined. A widow's promise, the secret love story behind the new Caldwell Center, and Architect of the Year or Wife of the Century. The narrative was set in stone. I was the grieving wife who had channeled her heartbreak into a triumphant monument for her late husband. The Caldwells, by contrast, were cast as the cold, oblivious benefactors, so detached from their own son that they had no idea what his final dream had been. The whispers in the city's elite circles, I later heard, were far less kind. They questioned how a family so obsessed with legacy could have been so ignorant of their own son's heart. I rode the wave of media attention from the sterile quiet of my hotel room. I gave one, and only one, interview to a respected architectural journal, in which I spoke only of Liam's brilliance and the design's philosophy. I refused to say a single negative word about his family. I didn't have to. My silence on the matter was more damning than any accusation I could have made. The most important moment of that day, however, came in the form of a video call. It was my son Leo, his face beaming from the screen of my laptop. He was 8 years old now, old enough to understand. "Mommy," he said, his voice full of a pride that struck me to my very core. "My friends saw you on TV. You were talking about Daddy's drawing. You were so brave." That was it. That was the only validation I had ever truly needed. The first crack in the Caldwell fortress appeared that evening. There was a soft knock on my hotel room door. It was Mark. He looked terrible. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face was pale, and his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a lifetime. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice rough. I stepped aside and he walked into the room, looking around at the impersonal space before turning back to face me. He didn't offer, the words sounding like they were being torn from him. "I am so, so sorry." He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I sat on that stage today and listened to you speak, and for the first time since he died, I actually saw my brother. Not Liam Caldwell, the spare heir who was always a little too artistic for my father's taste. I saw Liam, the man who loved you more than anything. And I realized we didn't just lose him, we buried him. We buried him under a mountain of expectations and legacy and cold, hard stone. And what you did today, you dug him out. You let him breathe again." He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. When Mom did that with the house, I knew it was wrong. I knew it was cruel, but I did nothing. I stood by and I did nothing because I was a coward. I've spent my entire life being afraid of her disapproval, and my cowardice cost you your home. It cost my nephew his home. I have to live with that. I just, I needed you to know that I know. I see it all now. It was a confession, a complete and total surrender. There was no artifice, no manipulation. It was just the raw, ugly, genuine regret of a man who had finally been forced to look at his own reflection. I sat down opposite him. "Thank you, Mark," I said quietly. There was no forgiveness in my voice, not yet. The wounds were too deep, but there was an absence of hatred. The anger had been replaced by a deep, weary sadness for the family that could have been. He told me about his mother. She had retreated to the estate, refusing to speak to anyone. She had watched the news reports, the endless cycle of my face, of Liam's sketch, and had apparently said only one thing before locking herself in her study. She took him from me again. Eleanor would never apologize. Her pride was too vast, her narcissism too complete, but her punishment was perhaps the most fitting of all. Her obsession with controlling the family's public image had led directly to its spectacular destruction. And in her quest to control her sons, she had now lost them both, one to death and the other to the truth. The encounter with Richard came a few days later, and it was, in its own way, even more shocking. From a man of so few words, it was a monumental confession. A few weeks later, before I moved back to Westfield permanently to oversee the project, I visited the construction site. The land had been cleared, the earth graded, ready for the foundations to be poured. I stood on the edge of the vast, muddy expanse, the plans for the building clutched in my hand, and I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for 4 years. The war was over. I had not set out to destroy the Caldwells. I had only set out to reclaim myself. But in doing so, I had forced them to confront the ugliest parts of their own souls. Their regret was not my victory. My victory was this empty plot of land. It was the chance to build something beautiful and permanent and true, not from the ashes of my old life, but from its strongest, most enduring foundations. It takes 4 years to build a landmark, 4 years of watching steel rise against the sky like a skeleton, of seeing glass catch the sun where before there was only empty air. It took that same amount of time for me to lose a life and then build a new one, piece by piece. Today, the Liam Caldwell Performing Arts Center stands as the glittering, celebrated heart of our city's downtown. And I, Elara Clark, am no longer a ghost haunting the past. I am the architect of my own future. My life now is a design I never could have drafted in my youth, yet it is more beautiful and more true than anything I had ever imagined. My firm, the one I started at a single drafting table in a rented room, now occupies 2 floors of a downtown building. We're sought after for our philosophy, for creating spaces that feel human, that breathe. I didn't just rebuild my career. I built one that was infused with the hard-won wisdom of my own story. I am no longer just an architect. I am a storyteller who uses light and space as my language. After the project was complete, I could have bought back the house on Sycamore Ridge. Mark, in one of his many acts of penance, had informed me the trust had left it sitting empty, an unsellable monument to their shame. He offered to arrange the sale back to me for $1. I thought about it for a long time, but I realized that home was a chapter that was finished. It was a beautiful story, but it was not my story anymore. Instead, I bought a piece of land on a hill overlooking the city, and I designed a new house for me and Leo. Our new home is nothing like the one on Sycamore Ridge. It is smaller, warmer, more intimate. It is a house built not for show but for living. It has wide, welcoming porches, a slightly chaotic garden that Leo and I tend to on the weekends, and a kitchen that is always filled with the smell of baking bread. It is a house built on a foundation of resilience. Mark is a tentative but constant presence in Leo's life. He is a changed man, the arrogance burned out of him, replaced by a quiet, somber kindness. He shows up for Leo's soccer games and helps him with his science fair projects. He is trying in his own broken way to be the uncle his brother would have wanted him to be. Our relationship is not one of easy friendship, but of a respectful truce, a shared commitment to the well-being of the boy we both love. Richard remains a man of few words, but his actions speak for him. Every year on Leo's birthday, a significant contribution is made to his college fund, the memo line always reading, "From your father." It is his quiet, ongoing apology, his attempt to build a bridge back from a shore of regret. And Eleanor remains in her gilded cage. She never speaks to me. I hear from Mark that she is a recluse, a queen ruling over an empire of silent, polished antiques. Her obsession with controlling her family's legacy resulted in its complete and utter implosion. She sought to preserve a perfect image, and in doing so, revealed the ugly truth beneath. I no longer feel anger towards her, only a profound and weary pity. She is a cautionary tale, a lesson in the ultimate poverty of a life without love or grace. My real family is the one I have curated. It is Leo, now a bright and funny 12-year-old who has his father's smile and my stubborn spirit. It is my circle of friends, women who supported me when I had nothing, who showed up with pizza on moving day and wine on the bad days. It is the community that embraced my story and championed my work. Family, I have learned, is not an obligation you are born into. It is a structure you build yourself, out of love, trust, and mutual respect. One evening, Leo and I were sitting on the porch of our new home. The sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. In the distance, the city skyline was beginning to light up, and the silhouette of the Performing Arts Center was unmistakable. Its gentle, soaring curves were a beacon against the twilight. "You know," Leo said, his voice thoughtful in that way he gets when he's about to say something profound, "I used to be sad when I looked at pictures of the old house, but I'm not anymore." "Oh yeah?" I asked, putting my arm around his shoulders. "Why is that?" He pointed towards the skyline. "Because Daddy's house was for the three of us. But that one," he said, gesturing to the illuminated landmark, "that's his house for everybody. And this one," he patted the porch railing, "this one is for us. For now." I pulled him closer, my heart swelling. #@meta. Pause is the courage to create beauty from your deepest pain, is the quiet integrity with which you live your life after the storm has passed. It is the understanding that the most magnificent structures are not built of steel and stone, but of love. We sat there for a long time, watching the stars come out, the quiet of our new life a comfortable blanket around us. The past was not erased, but it had been integrated, transformed from a source of pain into a source of strength. The blueprint of my life had been torn to shreds, but the one I had drawn in its place was truer, stronger, and infinitely more beautiful. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision to protect your family's well being? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to hear more real life stories of overcoming challenges. Remember, sometimes the most beautiful life is the one you have to rebuild from the ground up. Thank you for listening, and may you always find the courage to be the architect of your own happiness.